Foxconn is the largest contract electronics manufacturer in the world by far, generating about $200 billion of annual revenue. They manufacture iPhones, Androids, both Mac and Windows computers, gaming consoles including the Sony PlayStation and Nintendo Switch, and numerous brands of televisions and monitors just to name a few. It's more likely than not that you're watching this video on a device made by Foxconn. By leveraging cheap labor in places like China, Southeast Asia, and Eastern Europe, as well as achieving massive economies of scale, Foxconn can manufacture consumer electronics at extremely low costs. Thanks to Foxconn, it's now possible to buy budget Android smartphones for under $50. It wouldn't be much of an exaggeration to say that Foxconn is responsible for a personal computing revolution. Even people with very low incomes can now afford smartphones. For example, the per capita income in Indonesia is only $5,000 per year, yet an estimated 70% of the population have smartphones. In 2020, Foxconn unexpectedly announced that they'd be entering the electric vehicle industry. They plan to apply a similar business model as they use for consumer electronics. Instead of creating and marketing their own brand, they'll manufacture EVs on behalf of other brands. While Foxconn's EV strategy is still in the early years, they've already faced a number of setbacks. In the US, they partnered with two EV startups, Lordstown Motors and Fisker. Lordstown Motors has already gone bankrupt, and Fisker is on the brink of bankruptcy. Yet despite these setbacks, Foxconn is not backing down. They've committed to investing billions of dollars, and plan to eventually make half of all electric vehicles in the world. Han Hai Technology Group, doing business as Foxconn, was founded by a Taiwanese businessman called Terry Guo back in 1974. They started off making low-tech components for electronic devices. Their first product was plastic knobs, which they supplied to television manufacturers. Over the years, they started making more advanced electronic components, which they supplied to final electronics manufacturers. As the business grew, they set up factories in mainland China, where they could access the country's vast supply of low-cost labor. Back in the day, most consumer electronics companies manufactured their products themselves. They wanted to control the whole value chain, as this would give them the greatest control over product quality. They would purchase parts from Foxconn, but they wanted to do the final assembly themselves. As the consumer electronics industry became more and more competitive, it became clear that there really wasn't a whole lot of difference between different brands from a manufacturing perspective. The process of assembling a MacBook is pretty similar to assembling a Dell or HP laptop. Many of the individual components are very similar and could be made interchangeable. If each electronics company wants to manufacture their products themselves, they each need to spend massive amounts of money building their own factories with large fixed costs. This is expensive and inefficient. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, Foxconn went to all the major electronics brands with a simple sales pitch. Instead of spending huge amounts of money building your own factories, pay us to manufacture your products for you. Because we can aggregate manufacturing for many different brands, we can achieve economies of scale that you could never dream of. Outsourcing manufacturing allows electronics brands like Apple to focus all of their efforts on designing new products, software, and marketing. These activities offer much higher ROIs than the capital-intensive and low-margin business of manufacturing. When Apple launched the iPhone in 2007, they hired Foxconn to manufacture it. Foxconn has made every iPhone since then. Foxconn has over 700,000 employees, mostly in low-cost countries like China, Southeast Asia, and Eastern Europe. However, low labor costs is not Foxconn's competitive differentiator. Even before the rise of Foxconn, most American, European, and Japanese electronics brands build their own factories in low-cost countries. Foxconn's main advantage is to share common parts across a large number of devices. They work with their customers to include mostly standardized parts in their designs. For example, two Android phones Foxconn makes for two different brands might have the same microphone, memory chip, LEDs, display drivers, etc. Foxconn can order these standard parts in massive quantities to get bulk discounts. Employees can be trained to build one model of smartphone. Because the assembly process is so similar, that employee can easily be transferred to a different production line if the need arises. By aggregating demand from so many brands, Foxconn's aggregate order book is remarkably consistent. If one of their customers takes market share from another, Foxconn's demand is unchanged. This allows them to operate their giant factories at almost 100% utilization. According to the New York Times, Foxconn manufactures over 40% of all consumer electronics in the world. While Foxconn is the largest, there are also other contract manufacturers. It's likely that the majority, if not the vast majority of consumer electronics globally, are assembled by contractors. Now let's turn our attention to automobiles. There are automobile contract manufacturers. The largest is an Austrian company called Magna. They make automobile parts and in some cases do final vehicle assembly on behalf of their customers. They assemble cars for the likes of Toyota, BMW, and Mercedes, including the iconic Mercedes G-Wagon. Magna produces 200,000 vehicles per year. Globally, about 85 million cars are sold annually. So despite being the largest automobile contract manufacturer, Magna only produces less than 1% of all automobiles. Automakers typically prefer to own and operate their own factories. Most automakers don't use contractors at all, and even when they do, they only use them for a small percentage of their production. Foxconn wants to eventually manufacture half of all EVs sold globally. To determine whether this plan is realistic, we need to understand why automakers have historically avoided contract manufacturing, and how Foxconn plans to change this. There are a few key differences between automobiles and consumer electronics. Firstly, automobiles are much more complicated. While a smartphone or laptop computer might have hundreds of parts, automobiles can have many thousands of parts. The complicated nature of automobile assembly makes it very difficult for anyone to start a new contract manufacturing firm. Secondly, automobiles must comply with numerous government regulations to be street legal. These regulations can be complicated and vary by jurisdiction. Automakers like to assemble their cars themselves to make sure the manufacturing process adheres to quality standards. And finally, most large automakers have been building cars for a very long time. Looking at the big three US automakers, Chrysler will turn 100 next year. Ford and GM are even older. They've accumulated huge amounts of manufacturing experience and are big enough that they already have economies of scale. Thus, they don't feel the need to outsource manufacturing. While the automobile industry is very mature, the shift to electric vehicles finally presented an opportunity for Foxconn to break in. Most automakers are having a difficult time with the electric transition. For example, in the first quarter of this year, Ford's EV unit lost $130,000 for each car they sold. Currently, Tesla and BYD are the only companies in the world that make profits on EVs. Everyone else is losing money. With limited experience in EV manufacturing, many automakers need to rely on external suppliers for core pieces of technology. For example, GM doesn't make any of the components of its electric vehicle motors. Ford makes less than 10% of the components in its electric motors. All the legacy automakers suffer from a lack of experience. If you've been making internal combustion engines for the past 100 years, this will clearly be a more efficient process than making an electric powertrain, which they only started a couple of years ago. Finally, there are now a plethora of EV startups. Many of them built large factories, but demand for their cars was much lower than expected. The fixed costs of the factory are spread out across a small number of cars, making the cost per car astronomically high. Foxconn wants to solve these problems. If they can set up contract manufacturing, production for many different EV startups can be aggregated to achieve high factory utilization. Foxconn can also standardize parts across many different EV brands. In 2020, Foxconn created the Mobility and Harmony Consortium, or MIH. The goal of MIH is to create a set of open standards for electric vehicle design. If EV companies follow the MIH standards, this will make it easier for Foxconn to manufacture. Due to the high transportation costs, tariffs, and government tax incentives, Foxconn's strategy of aggregating production in low-cost countries won't work for EVs. In the US specifically, only domestically built cars can qualify for the $7,500 EV tax credit. To be viable, Foxconn needed to build a factory in the US. In 2021, they reached a deal to acquire an automobile factory from the EV startup Lordstown Motors. The factory was located in Lordstown, Ohio. Lordstown Motors had a short and troubled history. They acquired an abandoned GM factory in Lordstown, Ohio in 2019. A year later, the company went public by merging with a SPAC. They planned to make an electric pickup truck called the Endurance. In early 2021, the short-selling firm Hindenburg Research accused the company of misleading investors about their order backlog and production timeline. This caused Lordstown Motors' share price to tank, which greatly limited their financing options. Desperate for cash, they signed a deal to sell the factory to Foxconn for $230 million. Lordstown Motors would then pay Foxconn to build the Endurance pickup truck at the plant. The deal looked like a win-win. Lordstown got a much-needed cash infusion, while Foxconn got an automobile factory in the US, as well as its first EV customer. Lordstown Motors only ended up selling a few dozen cars with serious quality issues before they finally ended up going bankrupt in the summer of 2023. With Lordstown bankrupt, Foxconn lost its first EV customer, but they had still accomplished their main objective of acquiring an automobile factory in the US. They rebranded the factory as Foxconn, Ohio, and planned to use this to build cars for other customers. Shortly thereafter, they signed a deal with another EV startup, Fisker. They planned to produce the upcoming Fisker Pear at the Ohio factory, but Fisker is also facing financial troubles and appears to be on the brink of bankruptcy. At this point, it looks unlikely that the Pear will ever happen. Thus far, the only vehicles Foxconn has made at its Ohio factory are a few hundred electric farm tractors they're making for a California-based startup. This is not nearly enough to cover the factory's fixed costs. Foxconn's main problem is that they haven't been able to convince any established automakers to sign up as customers. Thus far, they've only been able to get desperate startups like Lordstown Motors and Fisker. The only other EV company they're working with is a Taiwanese brand called Foxtron. Foxtron is a joint venture between Foxconn and a tiny Taiwanese automaker called Yulon Motors. These Foxtron cars appear to be mostly for demonstration purposes, and are unlikely to enter mass production. Despite their early setbacks, Foxconn doesn't seem ready to give up anytime soon. In addition to their factory in Ohio, they're spending billions of dollars to build new factories in Thailand, India, and Saudi Arabia. With Foxconn's EV manufacturing capabilities still unproven, the established automakers aren't yet willing to take a chance with them. That's why they've been forced to dumpster dive with the likes of Fisker and Lordstown Motors. Making cars for money-losing EV startups will not be viable in the long run, because eventually all of these startups will go bankrupt. Foxconn's gamble is that they can use these startup customers to build up their manufacturing expertise and credibility. This could eventually allow them to convince large automakers like Ford or GM to hire them. If they can sign on a few large customers and start producing tens and then hundreds of thousands of cars, it's conceivable that they could achieve economies of scale and create a profitable business. Foxconn revolutionized the personal electronics industry, leveraging economies of scale and standardization to churn out billions of devices at prices so low they were previously unimaginable. They should not be underestimated. While their plan to eventually manufacture half of the world's EVs might sound outlandish, if anyone can do it, it's Foxconn. Alright guys, that wraps it up for this video. What do you think about Foxconn's EV plans? Is it a good idea, or should they just stick to consumer electronics? Let us know in the comments section below. As always, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Wall Street Millennial, signing out.